At Camp Whitmore, young recruit Jake Lawrence watches his grandfather, Walt, a weathered veteran, step onto the firing range. Mocked by peers and underestimated by instructors, Walt, once a legendary sniper, takes a dusty rifle and misses his first shot. Laughter follows, but Walt, unfazed, requests one more. In a breathless silence, his second shot splits the target dead center, stunning everyone. Whispers of his 1983 Fort Liberty record surface, hinting at a heroic past. As Jake grapples with pride and awe, the base commander arrives, unveiling Walt's legacy. What secrets does Walt's quiet strength still hold? Love Walt's story of quiet strength? Subscribe to our channel for more tales of unsung heroes. Share your own stories of inspiring figures in the comments. Support us to keep these powerful narratives alive. Hit that like button, share with a veteran, and let's honor legacies together. The morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the dew-soaked grass at Camp Whitmore, a modest army base nestled in the rolling plains of central Montana. A crisp breeze stirred the pines that fringed the gravel roads, carrying the faint clang of steel targets from the shooting range. The air buzzed with the sharp commands of instructors, their voices ricocheting off the barracks as recruits sweated through their drills. For most of the young soldiers, it was just another grueling day of basic training, another test to endure, another hurdle to clear. But for Private Jake Lawrence, this morning carried a weight that pressed against his chest, a mix of anticipation and pride that made his heart thrum. Jake stood in formation, his boots planted firmly in the dirt, but his eyes kept drifting toward the front gate. His fingers twitched at his sides, betraying the nervous energy coursing through him. Then, at last, he saw it. A faded blue Chevrolet Impala, stubborn and weathered like its owner, crawling up the side road in a cloud of dust. The engine sputtered to a stop near the range, and a tall, lean figure emerged. Walt Lawrence, Jake's grandfather, stood there, his back straight despite the years that had carved deep lines into his face. He wore an old corduroy jacket, pressed slacks, and a wool flat cap pulled low over his brow, shading eyes that held a quiet, unshakable calm. In one hand, he clutched a thermos of coffee, its dented metal surface glinting faintly in the light. In the other, a worn cane bore the scars of countless dirt roads and hospital hallways, a silent testament to a life hard lived. Jake's chest swelled with pride as he caught the instructor's nod and broke formation, jogging toward his grandfather with a grin that teetered between excitement and nerves. "Grandpa, you made it," he said, his voice bright but laced with awe. Walt's lips curved into a slow, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that spoke of patience and hard-won wisdom. 3 hours on I-90 and 20 minutes rattling over gravel, he replied, his voice low and steady, like the hum of a distant river. "But I made it. Had to see if they're teaching you kids to shoot straight." His words carried a warmth that wrapped around Jake, easing the tension in his shoulders. Across the field, a few recruits noticed the exchange. One nudged another, smirking. "Who's that? Grandpa G.I. Joe?" The quip drew a ripple of laughter, not malicious, but tinged with the careless arrogance of youth sizing up age. Walt either didn't hear or chose not to acknowledge it. His gaze swept over the base, slow and deliberate, like a man stepping back into a half-remembered dream. The barracks, the range, the distant pines, they stirred something deep within him, a flicker of memory that tightened his grip on the cane. Sergeant Holden, a no-nonsense instructor in his late 30s with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, approached Jake with a raised eyebrow. "Private Lawrence, is this your visitor?" he asked, his tone clipped but not unkind. Jake straightened, his voice firm. "Yes, sir, my grandfather. Sir, he served." Holden's eyes flicked to Walt, taking in the old man's quiet dignity. He nodded slowly. "He's welcome to observe. Just keep him behind the line. It's Marksmanship Day. Gets loud." Walt inclined his head, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Understood. I won't be in the way." As Jake rejoined his unit, Walt eased himself into a metal folding chair near the firing line, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. His hands rested on his cane, the sunlight catching the silver in his stubble. To the young soldiers bustling around him, he was just another old-timer, a shadow of a bygone era, respected by courtesy but dismissed by indifference. But Jake knew the truth, and before the day was done, the others would too. By early afternoon, the heat had thickened, weaving the scents of gun oil, sweat, and scorched metal into a heavy tapestry that clung to the skin. The marksmanship test was in full swing, the range alive with the sharp crack of rifles and the distant ping of bullets striking steel. Targets stood like silent sentinels across the field, their surfaces scarred from countless rounds. Recruits took their turns at the firing line, their faces taut with focus under the unforgiving scrutiny of their instructors. Jake was still waiting his turn, adjusting his stance and checking his rifle, but his eyes kept darting to his grandfather. Walt sat quietly at the edge of the range, his thermos cradled in one hand, his gaze fixed on the field. He hadn't spoken much since arriving, just sipped his coffee and watched, his silence as profound as the Montana sky. But there was a weight to his stillness, a presence that seemed to anchor the chaos around him. The other recruits barely noticed him, their attention consumed by the pressure of the test. To them, Walt was invisible, a relic irrelevant to their world of adrenaline and ambition. But Jake saw the way his grandfather's eyes tracked each shooter, the subtle tilt of his head as he assessed their form. There was no judgment in Walt's expression, only a quiet understanding, as if he were measuring the present against a past only he could see. Jake's heart ached with a mix of pride and longing. He wanted to prove himself, not just to his instructors, but to the man who had shaped his dreams of service. Then came the moment that shifted the air. Sergeant Holden, perhaps out of politeness or curiosity, approached Walt with a dusty M16, its stock worn smooth by countless hands. "Care to take a shot, sir?" he asked, his tone neutral, but tinged with skepticism. A few recruits snickered, exchanging glances that said they expected little from the old man. Walt looked at the rifle, then at Holden, his eyes unreadable. "Been a while," he said softly, setting his thermos on the ground. He rose, leaning lightly on his cane, and accepted the weapon with a reverence that silenced the chuckles. The range grew quiet as Walt stepped to the line, his movements slow but sure. The rifle looked heavy in his hands, and the recruits waited for the inevitable miss. Jake's stomach knotted, his breath shallow. Walt raised the rifle, his shoulders hunching slightly, and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt far from the target. A few soldiers laughed, their voices sharp in the stillness. Holden smirked, leaning toward a recruit and muttering, "Let's not waste too much ammo." Jake's face burned with embarrassment, but Walt didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, almost serene, as if the miss were a minor detail in a larger story. Then Walt lifted the rifle again. This time there was no tremble in his hands, no hesitation in his stance. His breath slowed, his body aligning with the weapon as if they were one. The range fell into a hush, the recruits sensing something they couldn't name. When the shot rang out, it was a single, perfect note in the silence. The target, 50 yards away, split clean through the center, the bullet carving a path as true as truth itself. The clang of the steel echoed across the field, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The recruits froze, their smirks replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Holden's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the target, then at Walt. Jake's heart soared, a fierce pride swelling in his chest. Walt lowered the rifle, his face betraying no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction. He handed the weapon back to Holden and returned to his chair, picking up his thermos as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the range was different now, charged with a reverence that hadn't been there before. Whispers rippled through the recruits, their glances no longer dismissive but curious, even awed. Word of the shot reached the base commander, Colonel Reynolds, a grizzled man with 30 years of service, etched into his face. He arrived at the range, his boots crunching on the gravel, and for a moment he said nothing. His eyes locked on Walt, who sat calmly, sipping his coffee. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, Reynolds removed his cap, a gesture of respect that sent a hush through the crowd. "That name on the plaque in the mess hall," he said, his voice carrying across the range. "It never faded, and today neither did your aim." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Walt inclined his head, a flicker of emotion passing through his eyes. Pride, yes, but also a quiet sorrow, as if the past had reached out to touch him. Jake stood taller, his chest tight with emotion. His grandfather was no longer just Grandpa Walt, the man who told stories of old wars over coffee at the kitchen table. He was Walter Lawrence, the ghost behind a 40-year record, a legend who had returned to remind them all of what endurance and skill could mean. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning chill, but the warmth in Jake's heart came from something deeper, a legacy that would never fade, carried forward in every shot he'd take from this day on. The air in the training range was thick, heavy with the sharp tang of gun oil and the electric hum of unspoken expectations. Walt stood at the edge of Lane 9, his frame a quiet testament to a life lived with purpose. His posture wasn't casual, not the slouch of a man merely passing through. It was the stance of someone who'd walked this ground before, whose gray eyes held stories no one had ever thought to ask about. The lane itself, cluttered with old test rifles set up for calibration or dry runs, felt like a forgotten corner of the world, waiting for someone to breathe life into it. A cluster of young recruits lingered nearby, their voices a low buzz, their glances flicking toward the old man who seemed both out of place and inexplicably rooted to the spot. Sergeant Daniels, a young instructor whose swagger outran his experience, strolled over, his boots scraping against the concrete floor. He caught sight of Walt, whose gaze was locked on the rifles with a focus that made Daniels pause, if only for a heartbeat. The sergeant's lips twitched into a half smirk, his voice carrying a teasing edge sharpened by condescension. "Ever shoot, old-timer?" he tossed out, the question light but barbed, like he was testing the waters without expecting much. Walt tilted his head, his weathered face giving nothing away. "Used to," he said, his voice low and steady, like the rumble of a distant storm. "Long time ago." There was no pride in his words, no defensiveness, just the quiet weight of truth. Daniel's eyes drifted to the rifle on the bench, a classic bolt-action model, more a relic for ceremonial drills than a tool of war these days. He gestured toward it, his grin stretching wider, inviting. "Well, we got an open lane. Want to give it a whirl? Just for kicks?" At his station nearby, Jake, Walt's grandson, went rigid, his fingers tightening around his own rifle. His jaw locked, a muscle pulsing beneath the skin. He knew his grandfather could shoot, had shot once, with a precision that had been whispered about in family stories, passed down like heirlooms. But that was before the accident, before the surgeries that had carved away the strength in Walt's hands and the steadiness in his legs. Time, Jake thought, was a thief, dulling even the sharpest edges. His chest constricted, a tangle of pride and fear twisting inside him, the kind of feeling that comes when you want to shield someone you love but know they're about to step into a moment you can't control. Walt didn't waver. He rose from his seat, his movements slow but certain, as if the act of standing was a choice he'd made years ago and never questioned since. He approached Lane 9 with a quiet authority, like a man reclaiming a piece of himself left behind. Jake's heart pounded, each beat louder than the last, a silent plea that his grandfather wouldn't stumble. Walt set his cane against the bench, the wood clattering softly against the metal, a small sound that felt louder in the stillness. He rolled his shoulders, deliberate and cautious, as if waking muscles that had been asleep for too long. Then he reached for the rifle. His hands, rough and scarred, moved with a reverence that hushed the murmurs of the recruits nearby. A few exchanged looks, their whispers sharp with doubt. "Is he really going to try that?" one muttered under his breath. "Hope they've got a medic on speed dial," another quipped, stifling a laugh. Daniels chuckled, leaning back on his heels, clearly relishing the moment. "All right, sir," he said, his voice thick with amusement. "Let's see what you got." Walt adjusted his glasses, the lenses glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. He squinted down the range, his eyes narrowing as if stripping away the years to a time when the world was clearer, when his hands didn't tremble and his body didn't ache. He drew a deep breath, slow and measured, and fired. The shot rang out, crisp and sharp, slicing through the air. But the laughter that followed was jagged, cutting. The bullet hadn't just missed the bullseye. It had missed the target entirely, vanishing into the backstop like a forgotten promise. Daniels' smirk widened, and he leaned toward a recruit, his voice carrying across the lane. "Let's not burn through too much ammo, huh?" The recruits snickered, their laughter a cruel echo that bounced off the walls. Jake's face burned, his ears hot with humiliation. He stared at the floor, unable to lift his eyes. He wanted to shout, to tell them they didn't know his grandfather, didn't know the man who'd once been a marksman, a soldier, a hero. But the words stuck in his throat, heavy and useless. This wasn't a moment for words. It was a moment where silence grew heavier than any sound, pressing down on everyone, even those too young to understand its weight. Walt, though, stood untouched by the laughter. He lowered the rifle, resting it against the bench with the same care he'd used to lift it. His face showed no shame, only a quiet thoughtfulness, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. A rhythm, a memory, a truth buried deep within. Then softly he spoke. "One more." Daniels blinked, caught off balance. "Sir," he said, his voice uncertain, the smirk faltering for the first time. Walt didn't look at him. He repeated, "One more." The words were simple, unadorned, but they carried a gravity that made the air feel denser. There was no pleading in his tone, no need for approval, just a statement, calm and unshakable, like a man who'd already seen the outcome in his mind's eye. For a moment, Daniels hesitated, his eyes flickering between amusement and something deeper. Respect, perhaps, or curiosity. He glanced at another instructor who gave a shrug as if to say, "Let him have it." Daniels nodded, his voice softer this time, less dismissive. "All right," he said, "one more." Walt stepped back to the line, his movements steady, unhurried. Jake stood frozen at his station, his rifle lowered, his eyes fixed on his grandfather. For the first time that day, he felt like he was truly seeing Walt. Not the man who leaned on a cane, not the grandfather who told stories of a war long past, but someone else, someone whose life stretched far beyond the edges of Jake's understanding. The recruits had fallen silent, their jokes swallowed by a tense anticipation, the kind that fills a room when something unexpected is about to unfold. Walt gripped the rifle differently this time, not tighter but with purpose, his fingers settling into their place as if they'd never left. He adjusted his stance, one foot back, shoulders squared, his knees steady now, as if the weight of years had lifted for just this moment. The cane, still resting on the bench, seemed like it belonged to another man, one who'd been tired. Broken. Not this man, not the one standing at lane 9. His thumb traced the stock of the rifle, slow and deliberate, like he was touching a memory carved into the wood. The range fell silent, not the hollow kind of quiet, but the kind that feels alive, heavy with possibility. Walt's breath slowed, in and out, each exhale a release of everything that didn't matter. The laughter, the doubts, the years. In his mind, there was no room for fear or anticipation, no thought of applause or failure. There was only the rhythm of 1,000 shots fired in places these recruits couldn't fathom, in moments that had shaped him into the man he was. The Montana wind was a fickle thing, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a howl, but in that moment, it held its breath. The world seemed to pause with it, narrowing to a single point where Walt Lawrence stood, his weathered hands steady on the rifle. The weapon wasn't feel like just metal, it was an extension of his soul, carrying the weight of moments where life and death hung in the balance. He raised it slowly, deliberately, his eyes locking onto the distant target through the sight. His heart beat steady, but beneath that calm pulsed a flicker of memory. Dusty trails, gunfire, and the faces of men who trusted him to pull this trigger when it mattered. Jake, his grandson, stood nearby, his chest tight with anticipation. He'd seen his grandfather handle a rifle before, picking off coyotes with a casual precision that seemed almost lazy. But this was different. This was the range, a place where recruits half-walked, strutted, and bragged, where Sergeant Daniels' sharp tongue cut through egos. Jake's eyes darted to Daniels, whose usual smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of focus, his arms crossed tight, as if bracing for something. The shot came sudden, a crack that split the air like thunder rolling over a lake. The sound echoed across the range, then faded into a silence so deep it felt alive. No one moved. The recruits, usually quick with snide remarks, stood frozen, eyes fixed on the target. Jake's breath caught, his heart pounding as he tried to read faces. Even the wind seemed to wait, stunned. Sergeant Daniels stepped forward, his boots crunching on gravel. His swagger was gone, replaced by a cautious tread. He leaned into the range scope, squinting with intensity. His jaw tightened, lips parted, but no words came. He straightened, rigid, and gestured for another instructor to look. One by one, they peered through the lens, each face mirroring shock, disbelief, awe. A young recruit lifted binoculars and gasped, "The bullseye's torn! Dead center! Dead center!" The target was split clean through, the paper fluttering like it had been sliced. Not grazed, but pierced perfectly. Walt lowered slowly, his face stone, betraying no pride. He turned to Jake, his voice low, "That'll do," carrying a finality that ached in Jake's chest. The silence deepened into reverence. Recruits no longer slouched. Daniel stood back, arms folded, expression unreadable, his eyes flicking to the target. It seemed to taunt and inspire him. Across the range, Master Sergeant Clayton stared, frozen. His grizzled face told of wars, yet he looked at Walt like a specter. Lawrence Walt, he'd buttered in, the name stirring a legend. He turned, boots crunching gravel, marching to the control building, sagging with peeling paint. Inside, dust swirled, paper smelled musty. A clunky computer hummed, its screen flickering. Clayton typed, "Lawrence Walt, Fort Liberty, 1980s. The search yielded one match. A grainy file appeared, a photo of a younger Walt beside a split target identical to today's. Text read, "Fort Liberty Marksmanship, 1983. Longest standing bullseye, 200 meters. One shot, no assist." The file continued. An after-action report. Engaged without orders, dies 3 hostiles, covered wounded. Held 43 minutes, saved 2 pinned soldiers, refused Bronze Star. Clayton stared, then printed, folding the page like something sacred. Outside, recruits whispered, "Who's Lawrence?" The name gained weight. Daniel stood silent, the bullseye a paradox of insult and awe. Jake lingered off, pride and confusion swirling. His quiet grandfather, who fixed fences, was more. Walt's gaze met Jake's, a flicker. Not pride, but acknowledgement of a life lived on terms few could grasp. Walt sipped his black coffee, the bitter warmth grounding him as he stood on the sun-scorched earth of the military range. The whispers of his family name floated through the air, carried by recruits and instructors alike, their voices tinged with something close to reverence. He never thought he'd find himself here again. Decades later, surrounded by the sharp crack of rifles and the weight of a past he had long since tucked away. His weathered hands, steady despite the years, cradled the thermos as he watched the world move around him, oblivious to the storm of memories swirling in his chest. Clayton stepped out of the control building, a single sheet of paper clutched in his hand. His face was unreadable, but his steps were deliberate, heavy with the weight of what he carried. Without a word, he passed the printout to Sergeant Daniels, who scanned the header and froze. Daniels' eyes flicked upward, slow and searching, landing on Walt. The older man was quietly cleaning his rifle, his movements precise, almost reverent, as he wiped down the barrel before slipping it into its canvas sleeve. There was no rush in his actions, no need to prove anything, just the steady rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Daniel's throat tightened as he held the paper, the numbers on it screaming a truth he hadn't been ready for. "Sir," Daniel said, his voice softer than he intended. "Is this you?" Walt didn't answer right away. He zipped the rifle bag shut, the sound cutting through the hum of the range. His glasses, scuffed and slightly crooked, caught the sunlight as he glanced up. His eyes, sharp despite the lines etched around them, held no trace of boastfulness. "It was no swagger, no pride," he said, his voice low and even. "Just truth." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward, shifting the air around them. In that moment, something changed. The recruits, who had been slouching and joking earlier, stood a little taller. The instructors, even the ones who had smirked at the old man when he arrived, straightened their spines. The target Walt had pierced wasn't just a bullseye anymore. It was a testament, a living echo of a legacy that refused to fade. Whispers spread like wildfire through the ranks. He held the record. Fort Liberty sniper. That was him. That guy saved a whole unit. The words wove through the crowd, each syllable heavy with awe. But Walt seemed untouched by it. Maybe he didn't hear the murmurs. Or maybe, long ago, he'd learned to let the noise of praise slip past him, like wind through the grass. The gravel outside Camp Whitmore's firing range crunched under the weight of heavy tires. pulling every gaze toward the sound. A black SUV, its government plates gleaming under the midday sun, rolled to a stop near the command post. A small American flag decal fluttered on its side, a quiet symbol of authority. The door opened with a deliberate click, and out stepped Colonel Richard Monroe, his neatly pressed fatigues crisp against the dusty backdrop. He didn't shout orders or demand attention. His presence alone was enough. The recruits snapped to attention, their earlier chatter silenced. Even Daniels, whose smirk had vanished, stepped aside, his eyes flickering with something like unease. Monroe's gaze cut through the crowd, landing not on the staff or the instructors, but on the older man seated near lane 9. Walt was calmly screwing the cap onto his thermos, his face serene, as if the weight of the moment didn't touch him. The colonel approached with measured steps, the wind tugging at the edge of his coat. He stopped a few feet from Walt, his posture rigid but his eyes soft with something deeper. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a shared history. Walt looked up slowly, his expression unhurried, like a man who had seen too much to be rattled by ceremony. For a moment, Monroe stood still, longer than most would have expected. Then, with a deliberate motion, he removed his cap, holding it against his chest. "Sir," he said, his voice low, almost reverent, "we've kept your plaque above the range office for 40 years. Every year, your name comes up in stories, but most of us, we didn't know you were still alive." Walt gave a slow nod, his eyes tracing the horizon as if acknowledging not just the words, but the weight of time itself. "I wasn't trying to be remembered," he said, his voice steady, carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had long since made peace with his past. Monroe's gaze shifted to the paper target still fluttering at the end of the lane, its perfect hole a silent testament to skill that hadn't faded. "That shot today," the colonel said, his voice tight with meaning, "that wasn't luck." He looked back at Walt, searching for a reaction. "You never missed when it counted." Walt didn't smile or deny it. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes drifting to the distance, where the horizon blurred into memory. There was something out there, something more important than the praise or the whispers or the plaque. Maybe it was the faces of the men he'd saved, the ones whose names he still carried in the quiet corners of his mind. Or maybe it was just the simplicity of a life lived on his own terms, free from the need for applause. The wind picked up, soft but persistent, carrying with it a quiet respect that settled over the range. The recruits watched, their faces unreadable, their earlier jokes replaced by a dawning understanding. The man they'd dismissed as just another old-timer was now the man their commander addressed with reverence. Among them, Jake stood at the edge of the crowd, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. It wasn't pride in Walt's marksmanship, though that was undeniable. It was something deeper, a recognition of the character behind it, the kind of strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. Monroe extended his hand, the gesture simple but heavy with meaning. Walt hesitated for a heartbeat, then rose slowly, his cane untouched beside him. He shook the colonel's hand, his grip firm despite the years. Monroe nodded once more, his voice quieter now. "If it's all right with you, we'd like to hang that target next to your plaque." Walt's eyes drifted to the range, where the paper target swayed in the breeze. "It's just a piece of paper," he said, his tone dismissive but not unkind. The colonel's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's not what it means." Walt gave a small shrug, the gesture almost imperceptible. "Do what you need to do." With that, he sat back down, the moment passing like a wave retreating from the shore. But the silence that followed carried more weight than any ceremony could. It was the silence of respect earned, of a life lived quietly but fiercely, of a man who didn't need the world's applause to know who he was. The sun sank slowly behind the towering Montana pines, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the gravel paths winding through the tan barrack buildings of Camp Whitmore. The firing range, once alive with the sharp cracks of rifles and the shouts of drill instructors, had fallen silent. The recruits had been dismissed for chow, their boots crunching away toward the mess hall, leaving the air heavy with the stillness of dusk. Jake, however, had chosen to forgo dinner. His stomach knotted with something deeper than hunger. Walt, his grandfather, had made the same choice, and now the two men walked side by side toward the barracks, their steps slow and deliberate, sharing a quiet that felt like an extension of the range's earlier hush. No words passed between them, but the silence was thick with unspoken thoughts, a mutual understanding that hung like the fading light. Inside the common room, the dimness wrapped around them like a worn blanket. The space was nearly deserted, save for the faint hum of a flickering bulb overhead and the distant clatter of dishes from the mess hall. Jake dragged two rickety folding chairs to a corner near a dusty window, where the last slivers of daylight spilled through, illuminating specks of dust dancing in the air. Walt eased himself into one of the chairs, his movements careful, deliberate, as if each motion carried the weight of years. He set his canvas rifle bag down beside him, its faded green fabric scuffed and worn from countless days at the range. Reaching into the side pocket, he paused, his fingers lingering as if hesitant to unearth what lay within. "You ever wonder," he said, his voice low, almost swallowed by the room's quiet, "why I never talked about any of it?" Jake's eyes met his grandfather's, searching the weathered lines of his face for answers he'd long sensed but never grasped. "Every day, Grandpa," he replied, his voice soft but steady, carrying a mix of curiosity and reverence. Walt nodded, a faint gesture that seemed to acknowledge the weight of the question. From the bag, he drew a thin leather folder, its edges cracked and peeling, the kind of relic that had endured too many seasons to count. He opened it with a reverence that made Jake's breath catch, laying it flat on the small, scarred table between them. Inside was a photograph, its colors faded by time and sunlight, the edges curled and worn. It captured a younger Walt, barely older than Jake was now, crouched in a muddy field, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. Beside him were two other soldiers, one with a bloodied bandage wrapped tightly around his head, his eyes distant but resolute. The other slumped in a wheelchair, his right arm ending in a stump as he raised it in a salute that seemed to defy his broken body. Walt's chest bore no medals in the image, only the grime of battle and eyes that held a weariness too profound for his youth. Jake reached for the photograph, his fingers brushing it as if it might crumble under his touch. This is you," he whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of recognition. "Who are the other guys?" Walt took a slow, shuddering breath, his gaze drifting to the window, where the last light of day clung to the horizon. "The one standing was Lieutenant Parker," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "Good kid. Took a hit during that mission. The other was Corporal Dominguez. We pulled him out from under a flipped transport. He never walked again." Jake's eyes flicked to a torn newspaper clipping tucked behind the photo, its headline barely legible but searing in its clarity. "Sniper rescues wounded under fire. Declines citation." His heart thudded as he processed the words. "You saved them?" he said, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief, though it carried the lilt of a question. Walt's response was quiet, almost reluctant. "I tried," he said, the words heavy with a grief that seemed to settle into the lines of his face. "Only Parker made it through the week." The weight in his voice was denser than any rifle he'd ever carried, a burden that seemed to press against his chest even now, decades later. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant, as if staring into the past. "That day," he continued, his voice softening to a near whisper, "I took the shot that ended the ambush. Got us out. Everyone called me a hero, but it didn't feel like a win, Jake. It felt like a trade. I walked out. Some didn't. That changes how you see yourself." Jake sat in silence, the photograph still in his hands, its edges biting into his palms. He wanted to speak, to fill the void with questions or reassurances, but the weight of Walt's words held him still, letting the truth settle like dust in the quiet room. Walt's gaze remained fixed on some unseen point, his mind clearly replaying moments Jake could only imagine. "I stopped competing after that," Walt said, his voice steadier now, but still laced with regret. "Didn't go back to the sniper program. Didn't chase medals or promotions. Just trained. Helped the next ones come up. Stayed behind the line." Jake's brow furrowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Walt's eyes met his, sharp and piercing despite the years. "Because I was good at what I did. Too good. And when you carry a gift like that, when it's tied to loss, it stops feeling like a skill. It starts feeling like a burden." The words hung between them, raw and unadorned, a confession that carried the weight of a lifetime. Jake's gaze dropped back to the photograph, tracing the faces of the men who had shared that moment with his grandfather, men whose stories were now etched into the lines of Walt's face. "But you saved lives," he said, his voice firm but pleading, as if trying to pull Walt back from the edge of his own memories. Walt's eyes softened, but there was no lightness in them. "That doesn't always balance the scale," he said, his voice cracking just enough to betray the pain he'd carried for decades. They sat in silence, the photograph and the clipping lying between them like relics of a war that had never truly ended for Walt. Jake's chest ached with a mix of pride and sorrow, wishing he could reach into the past and shoulder some of his grandfather's burden. "I wish I'd known," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Walt's lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile, the kind that held more understanding than joy. "You know now," he said. "That's enough." In that moment, as something shifted, Jake, who had always seen his grandfather as a quiet, steady presence, now saw the man beneath, the one who had carried the weight of lives saved and lost, who had chosen silence, not out of shame, but out of reverence for what he'd endured. Without thinking, Jake leaned forward and wrapped his arms around Walt, a gesture he hadn't made since he was a boy. No words passed between them, only the quiet understanding that sometimes a hug could say what words never could. On the table, beside the rifle bag in the worn photograph, lay the unspoken truth of a man who had never sought the spotlight, only a reason to keep aiming true. The next morning, a thick fog blanketed Camp Whitmore, cloaking the grounds in a ghostly haze. Dew clung to the grass, sparkling faintly under the early light, and the metal benches along the firing lanes gleamed with moisture. The air was still, too early for the shouts of drill instructors or the rhythm of marching boots. But Lane 9 was already prepared, its targets stark against the misty backdrop. 4 recruits stood shoulder to shoulder, their rifles in hand, adjusting their stances with a nervous energy that betrayed their inexperience. These were the same 4 who had laughed and joked the day before, their voices carrying across the range with youthful bravado. Now their faces were set, their eyes focused, the weight of the morning silence pressing against them. Walt sat a few paces behind, perched on an old wooden bench, his battered thermos of black coffee in hand. Steam rose from the cup, curling into the cool air as he sipped slowly, his eyes fixed on the recruits. He offered no instructions, no sharp corrections, no bark commands. He didn't even hold a rifle, yet his presence was a force unto itself, a quiet authority that needed no words. The recruits felt it, their movements more deliberate under his gaze, as if they understood that every shot they took that was being measured against a standard they couldn't yet comprehend. Jake stood at the edge of the group, a clipboard in hand, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He didn't shout orders or pace the line like the other instructors. Instead, he repeated the lessons Walt had instilled in him over the years, his voice low and steady, carrying the same quiet conviction his grandfather had always embodied. Each word was a thread, connecting the recruits to the legacy of a man who had seen the cost of precision and chosen to pass on its lessons rather than its glory. In the fog, under Walt's watchful eye, the recruits took aim, their shots cutting through the morning silence. Each one a testament to the man who had taught them to see not just the target, but the weight of every choice behind it. The morning air carried a gentle bite, crisp and clean, as the recruits lined up at the range, their rifles gleaming under the early sun. Each shot echoed across the open field, a sharp crack followed by the soft rustle of wind through the trees. The recruits, young and eager but unpolished, gripped their weapons with a mix of determination and uncertainty. They fired, missed, adjusted their stance, and fired again. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, their shots began to cluster closer to the target's heart. Not perfect, not yet, but tighter, more deliberate. The hesitation that had plagued their earlier attempts was fading, replaced by a quiet focus. Walt Lawrence sat on the old wooden bench at the edge of the range, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. He didn't move much, his posture steady as the oak behind him, but his eyes missed nothing. Each time a recruit landed a clean shot, his gaze sharpened, the faintest narrowing of his eyes betraying a flicker of approval. No grand gestures, no words, just a small nod, subtle but heavy with meaning. To the recruits, it was as if that nod carried the weight of a lifetime's experience, a silent affirmation that they were on the right path. Walt's presence wasn't loud or imposing, but it settled over the range like a calm hand, guiding without commanding. His stillness spoke of patience, of lessons learned not in a classroom but in moments when precision meant survival. The recruits felt it, even if they couldn't name it, and it steadied their hands, slowed their breaths. Jake, Walt's grandson, stood nearby, watching the recruits with a mix of pride and curiosity. He'd grown up hearing stories of his grandfather's marksmanship, tales of impossible shots and quiet heroism that felt more like legend than reality. Now, seeing Walt in this element, Jake felt a swell of admiration, tempered by the weight of expectation. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "They're listening now," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. Walt's eyes flicked toward him, sharp and knowing. "They're trying now," he corrected, his tone even but firm. The distinction wasn't lost on Jake. Listening was passive, a surface act. Trying was something deeper, a commitment, a willingness to wrestle with failure and keep going. Jake nodded, chastened but not embarrassed. He knew his grandfather saw the world in layers, each action carrying a purpose that went beyond the moment. 2 lanes over, Sergeant Daniels leaned against a weathered post, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The day before, he'd been all sharp edges and confidence, his voice carrying the smug assurance of a man who thought he'd seen it all. But now his expression had softened, the hard lines of his face giving way to something more thoughtful. He watched Walt, not the recruits, his eyes tracing the old man's stillness as if trying to unravel a puzzle. How did someone command such respect without raising their voice? How did Walt, with nothing but a nod and a glance, get inside the heads of these raw recruits? Daniel's curiosity wasn't just professional, it was personal. He'd underestimated Walt, dismissed him as a relic, a bystander. Now he was beginning to see the depth of his mistake, and it stirred a restless unease in him. One of the younger recruits, Mason, barely 19 soon, lowered his rifle after a frustrating round. His shots kept drifting left, each miss chipping away at his confidence. He glanced toward Walt's bench, his face a mix of hesitation and hope. "Sir," he called out, his voice cracking slightly with nerves. "Am I holding it right? I keep drifting left." Walt looked up from his coffee, his gaze steady but not unkind. He raised a hand, not in a wave but a quiet summons, beckoning Mason closer. The young recruit approached, his steps tentative, as if he were standing before a judge. Walt's eyes settled on Mason's shoulder, noting the tension in his stance. "You're not leaning into the rifle," Walt said, his voice low and deliberate, like a teacher revealing a simple truth. "You're resisting it. Let it settle into you." Mason blinked, his mind racing to process the advice. "Like, relax?" he asked, uncertain. Walt's nod was slow, deliberate. "Exactly. You're trying to wrestle the rifle into submission. That's not how it works. A good shot comes from trust. Trust in your stance, your breath, your rhythm. The rifle's not your enemy. It's part of you." Mason's shoulders loosened slightly, as if Walt's words had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. He returned to his lane, adjusted his grip, and took a deep breath. This time when he fired, the bullet found the bullseye. The sharp ping of the target rang out, and Mason exhaled, a grin breaking across his face. He turned, seeking Walt's gaze. The old man didn't cheer or clap, just offered that single, unmistakable nod. To Mason, it felt like a medal, a quiet acknowledgement that he'd crossed some invisible threshold. By midday, the sun hung high, casting sharp shadows across the range. The 4 recruits had each fired their best rounds yet, their shots clustering tighter, their movements smoother. Walt still hadn't touched a rifle, and he didn't need to. His influence was in the air, in the way the recruits now stood a little straighter, breathed a little deeper. He wasn't teaching them to shoot. He was teaching them to trust themselves, to let the rifle become an extension of their will. His legacy wasn't in the medals tucked away in some forgotten drawer, but in these moments, posture, breath, the quiet belief that precision came from within. As the range cleared out, the recruits packed up their gear, their voices lighter now, tinged with the camaraderie of shared effort. Some stole glances back at the bench where Walt sat, still as ever, his coffee nearly gone. The air had warmed, carrying the promise of summer, but Walt seemed untouched by it. His eyes followed the wind as it stirred the trees, his thoughts drifting somewhere beyond the range, perhaps to memories of other days, other shots, other lives. Footsteps crunched on the gravel, deliberate and heavy. Sergeant Daniels approached, his cap in hand, his usual swagger replaced by something humbler. He stood beside Walt for a moment, silent, as if searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow. Walt didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He knew who it was, could feel the weight of Daniels' unspoken thoughts. Finally, Daniels cleared his throat. "Sir," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "I wanted to say something." Walt raised an eyebrow just enough to signal he was listening, but he stayed silent, letting Daniels find his way. Daniels shifted his weight, the gravel crunching under his boots. "Yesterday I made assumptions. I saw you sitting there and I thought you were just tagging along. A visitor. I didn't realize I was standing next to the man who wrote half the training manuals we still use." Walt turned his head then, meeting Daniel's gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, no trace of wounded pride, just a calm born of years spent watching people stumble, learn, and grow. "We all do," Walt said evenly. "Assume, I mean, until we learn not to." Daniels looked down, a flicker of shame crossing his face before he nodded. "Fair enough," he said, the words carrying a weight of acknowledgement. There wasn't much more to say. Walt extended his hand and Daniels took it, their grip firm, a quiet exchange of respect and understanding. As Daniels turned to leave, he paused, glancing back. "Just so you know, that target you hit yesterday, we framed it. It's going up next to the 1983 plaque." Walt's eyebrow lifted again, a spark of amusement in his eyes. "Still got that plaque, huh?" Daniels smirked, a hint of his old confidence returning. "We do now." Inside the range office, the staff had already hung the new frame. It was simple, unadorned, a single target, its center torn clean through by Walt's shot. Below it, a small brass plate gleamed, catching the light. The inscription was understated, like the man himself, but it carried the weight of a legacy that needed no embellishment. In the fading light of a late afternoon in 2023, Fort Liberty's Camp Whitmore stretched out under a sky painted in hues of amber and gold. The sun, heavy and slow, dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the main field where the day's last warmth clung to the earth. A soft breeze stirred, tugging at the frayed edges of an American flag that hung proudly atop an old wooden pole near the barracks. Its gentle snapping was the only sound breaking the quiet, save for the distant pop of gunfire rolling up from the firing range below. Beneath the flag, on a weathered wooden bench worn smooth by years of use, sat Walt Lawrence. His cane leaned against the bench, its polished handle catching the light. In his hands, he cradled a steaming cup of black coffee, the kind he'd always preferred. Simple, unadorned, like the man himself. A folded napkin rested beside the cup, but Walt's gaze wasn't on either. His eyes, sharp despite the lines etched around them, were trained on the firing range far below, where the silhouettes of young recruits moved with purpose. Beside him sat Jake, his elbows propped onto his knees, his posture relaxed but attentive. The two men shared a silence that felt full, not empty, as if words weren't needed to bridge the understanding between them. Walt Lawrence had first walked these grounds in 1983, a young man then, precise and unassuming, carrying a quiet strength that didn't demand attention but earned it all the same. Now, 40 years later, he'd returned, not with fanfare or medals pinned to his chest, but with the same steady presence that had defined him all those years ago. No headlines heralded his arrival, no ceremonies marked his name, and yet, in the way he sat, in the way his eyes followed the recruits below, there was a weight to his presence that spoke louder than any speech could. For Walt, legacy wasn't about noise or recognition. It was about the things that endured. A framed target on a wall, a lesson passed down, a moment that lingered in the heart long after the sound of a shot had faded. The firing range hummed with activity. The soft crack of rifles mingled with the voices of instructors, their commands clear but calm, guiding the recruits through adjustments and corrections. These were the same lessons Walt had learned decades before, the same ones he'd taught others in his time. The rhythm of it all felt timeless, like a heartbeat that never faltered. Walt's thoughts drifted as he watched, his mind weaving through memories of his own days on that range. He remembered the weight of a rifle in his hands, the focus it demanded, the satisfaction of a shot that hit true. But more than that, he remembered the men who'd stood beside him, their voices, their laughter, their quiet moments of doubt and triumph. They were gone now, many of them, but their echoes remained in the lessons they'd shared, in the way they'd shaped him into the man he was now. Jake, too, was lost in thought, his eyes tracing the horizon where the sun's glow met the earth. He'd known Walt for years, had heard the stories, not the polished ones told for crowds, but the raw, unfiltered ones shared over coffee or in the quiet of a long drive. Jake admired Walt's humility, the way he never seemed to chase glory or dwell on his own accomplishments. Sitting here now, Jake felt the weight of that legacy, not as a burden, but as an invitation to listen, to learn, to carry something forward. The silence between them stretched on, comfortable and unbroken, until Walt's voice finally cut through, low and steady, like the rumble of a distant storm. "Some legacies don't shout," Walt said. "Oh, Sam." His eyes still fixed on the range. "They just echo long enough for someone else to hear." The words landed softly, but they carried a depth that made Jake pause. He turned his head, studying Walt's face, the faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, the quiet certainty in his gaze. Jake let the words settle, feeling their truth sink into him. He looked out across the base, past the barracks and the flagpole, to where the recruits were lining up at the firing range. They were young, their faces a mix of determination and uncertainty, learning in real time what it meant to aim true, not just with a rifle, but with their lives. Jake wondered what they'd carry forward, what lessons would take root in their hearts and shape the years ahead. "Do you think they'll remember you?" Jake asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. Walt took a slow sip of his coffee, the steam curling upward before vanishing into the cooling air. He considered the question, his thoughts drifting to the faces of the men he'd trained, the years he'd spent pouring himself into something bigger than his own name. "Doesn't matter," he said at last, his tone gentle but firm. He glanced at Jake, that faint smile returning, softening the lines of his weathered face. "They'll remember how they felt when that shot landed. They'll remember what it meant. And if I did it right, they'll pass it on without even knowing it." The flag above them snapped again, caught in a sudden gust, and Jake's eyes flicked upward. He felt something stir in his chest, a quiet awe, a recognition of the truth in Walt's words. Legacy wasn't about being remembered. It was about leaving something behind that lived on in others. It was about the way those recruits felt when they hit their mark, the pride and purpose that would stay with them long after they left this place. Jake realized that Walt's strength lay not in his own story, but in the stories he'd helped others write, in the moments he'd shaped without ever asking for credit. Down on the range, a young recruit hit a clean center mark. The sound reached them, sharp and clear, and Jake's face broke into a small smile. He glanced at Walt, expecting a comment, but Walt only nodded once, his expression unreadable. There was no need for words. The moment spoke for itself. Walt's eyes drifted back to the flag, its gaze steady, and Jake followed suit, his thoughts turning inward. He thought about the people who'd known who'd his life shaped, the quiet heroes who'd taught without him preaching, who'd led by example without ever raising their voice. He wondered if he could do the same, if he could carry Walt's lesson forward in his own way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting Camp Whitmore into twilight's embrace, Walt rose slowly from the bench, his cane in hand. He didn't look back at the range as he walked away, but something lingered in the air, a presence, a memory, a legacy that needed no fanfare to endure. The sound of that perfect shot had faded, but its echo remained, woven into the fabric of those who'd heard it. It wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about the quiet integrity that defined people like Walt in a noisy world that often demanded attention over substance. In that moment, Jake understood that true strength didn't need a spotlight or a uniform or a stage. Sometimes it was in the act of sitting quietly, of watching and listening, of passing on a lesson with a few carefully chosen words. Walt Lawrence's story was a reminder that the most enduring legacies were often built, not shouted ones, but lived, carried forward, by those who'd been paying attention all along. And as the stars began to twinkle in the deepening sky, Jake felt a quiet resolve to do just that, to listen, to learn, and to carry forward the echo of a man whose strength had been in his silence.